problems with sharing my screen, so just give me a second. If you can just tell me if it looks okay when it comes up.
Okay.
Is that sharing now?
It is, yeah, if you want to go into presenter mode, and then we should be fine.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to have to stop again.
Okay.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. I'm just having a problem with my screens.
Okay. Amy, let me know if you want. I've got the PDF. I can share the PDF.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, let me just try that one more time. Here we go. Let's see if this will work.
Okay.
It's not giving me an option to share it in the other view.
Right.
I don't know why.
Okay, that's weird because it was fine.
It was working,
ago, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you want to just share the PDF, and I think we'll just have to work?
Yep. Yeah, no problem. That's fine. Okay.
Amy, I could also share from mine if you want to, and I could control slides. So.
Should we just go with the PDF? I think it should work fine. It just means we've lost the animation.
Okay.
Okay, so that was a good start. Sorry about that, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our session today. And we're really pleased to be able to share with you the results of many months of work where we've been reviewing the findings from several projects to explore our model of teacher activity groups for professional development. We're going to talk a bit more about exactly what a teacher activity group or a TAG is in a moment. But as we begin, it's important to highlight, I think, where the TAG model has come from. So as many of you will know, at the British Council, we have a particular focus on teacher education working in over 100 countries globally, often with an emphasis on English language teaching and learning. And research evidence has shown us that ongoing professional development is important for teaching success, but also that top-down teacher development, where the government or other superiors make decisions about what teachers will learn, is much less effective than when the focus of this study comes from teachers themselves. We also know that collaboration between teachers or communities of practice can be hugely supportive and can help teachers to find solutions to the many challenges that we face in the classroom. And so, as we were looking for an alternative to the often government-mandated workshops, the TAG model was born. Next slide, please, Paul. So during this session, we're aiming to answer the following questions. We're looking at what makes the TAG model unique. We're also going to try to answer the question of how tags have been implemented in British Council continuing professional development projects in different countries. We're looking at the evidence that's available from these projects about the impact of tags on teacher development, the challenges for the impactful implementation of tags, and also the conditions that we know or we can see that are required to make tags effective. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Radhika. Over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Paul, next slide, please. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Amy, again. I think one good starting point for all of us while doing the review was to look at the concept of continuing professional development as a social activity and examine the concept of CPD itself. So as you can see, one of the definitions we found during the review was teaching improves most in collegial settings where common goals are set and expertise is shared. So I'm just going to read some of these quotes out for the benefit of those who may have joined on the phone, just so that you're able to read and maybe not able to read from your small screens. Well, looking at this definition, then, you know, a lot of us think that CPD is an individual activity or the process is very individual, but a lot of research now focuses on the importance of collaboration, really, on collective participation or active learning, really. So there is a lot of contemporary consensus that teacher ownership of the learning process, and if the intervention is linked to the needs, makes the intervention very, very effective. So from moving on from CPD and looking at some of the features that bring us close to the concept of communities of practice, let's move on to see what communities of practice are. Next slide, please. So as you can see, one of the definitions on the screen is groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. So this is one of the key definitions, I would say, of a community of practice. Now, other definitions include a lot of focus on social learning systems or group of people informally bound together by shared expertise. At this point, I think it's also very important to note that communities of practice are also known by different phrases and terms across the world. So some of them are called professional learning communities. Some of them are called professional learning networks, especially in the virtual context, or teacher communities. We are going to talk about teacher activity groups, which in a bit, though, which is our form of community of practice, if I may say so. Moving on to the next slide. So let's unpack this concept of communities of practice a little more. So as you can see, there are 5 aspects or 5 key features of a community of practice. So there is group. As we looked at the definition earlier, people coming together is very important. It's essential. It's at the center of building this community of practice. This group of people sharing interests, right? Sharing common passions, common questions for investigation, or even a common purpose is again very essential. Building practice through this community, through interaction and different forms of engagement, and aligning this engagement through sharing messages, sharing ideas, sharing reflections to broader goals of the community, again becomes a key feature of communities of practice. Moving on to learning then, sustained learning, the group being able to initiate that learning, a spirit of mutual learning together, doing things together, and an overall self-awareness from the group about the engagement in the group is again one of the key features. And to end with, the most important point, regular interaction, consistent, continuous engagement and interaction in this community of practice, which in fact builds the practice and learning is key to this concept. So just to summarize, group, shared interest, practice, learning, regular interaction. So moving on then. We thought that before we dive into the concept of communities of practice a little more, maybe a good idea to juxtapose what the traditional Cascade model looks like versus what a community of practice model looks like. But at this point, I think it's important to note that it may not be helpful to look at the Cascade and the COP model as being at the extremes of a continuum, really, or in black and white terms. Both of them have their own place and value in the process of continuing professional development. It is just with an intention to look at basic features that where they are different is where we come from, really. So if you look at the Cascade model on the left of your screen, you can see an expert at the center of it, really not at the center, but actually top of the model. It's really expert driven, it's top down. It does reach large numbers, which is a plus for this model. And the nature of learning, even from this visual, seems like there is a lot of receiving of information and knowledge as opposed to maybe reflecting or discovering information. Cascade interventions also sometimes have short burst or large scale sort of interventions. And the most common criticism, as I'm sure you all know, of the Cascade model is the fact that the information that's passed on from the expert is diluted by the time it reaches its beneficiaries. So this is the Cascade model on one hand. And whereas if you look at the communities of practice model on the right, You have the teacher at the center of, rather teachers, a group of teachers at the center of the model, and learning and development happens through sharing, talking, thinking, inquiring, and reflecting. So it's in that sense, as opposed to the Cascade model, it's bottom up, really, starting from the teacher, initiated by the teacher. Another important point about the communities of practice model is that it's quite widely applied and used in other domains beyond the education domain. There is a lot of, it does have a lot of popularity in the domain of business, for example. And as Amy mentioned, I mean, just before handing it over to Amy, as I mentioned earlier, that there are different names to these communities of practice. And one of the names that we have for it is teacher activity groups that Amy is going to talk about and tell you more about. Thanks, Paul. And over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Radhika. So yes, you might be asking yourself, so what exactly is a teacher activity group or a TAG? And it's definitely a type of community of practice, but it's a structured, facilitated, and sustained group that meets regularly, ideally on a monthly basis, is what we've built into most of our projects. And meetings might be for 1 or 2 hours. And critically, there's limited travel involved for the participants. So again, unlike some of the other models that you might see where teachers have residential for perhaps a week of workshops, in this case, they're meeting on a regular basis. The structure that a TAG has is one of the things that can differentiate it from a more informal community of practice. The facilitation can also make it unique. And there is, because at least at the outset of a teacher activity group being set up, there's a named facilitator who will guide the discussion and the activity. Although this role can be shared and potentially it might disappear over time as the group becomes more well-practiced with sharing and collaborating together. Importantly, TAGs are often, but not always, supported as a government initiative, and teachers have some compulsion to attend. So it's not an optional thing in most cases, there's some element of it being mandatory. And also, unlike other communities of practice, TAGs generally haven't organically emerged, but instead have been designed by others for teachers to participate in. In TAGs, teachers learn with each other and from one another. And increasingly, especially during the COVID-19 period, we're seeing TAGs move online and teachers meeting remotely rather than always meeting face-to-face. And during a TAG meeting, teachers share and reflect, and they usually work through a variety of activities together to focus on specific aspects of teaching. The overall aim of teachers participating in TAGs is, of course, to improve teaching and learning in the classroom. So let's look a little bit more closely at what happens during a TAG meeting. Paul, if you can move on to the next slide. There's a strong focus on sharing and collaboration. Teachers bring their ideas and their questions to the group, and they work together to find out solutions and answers. They might find these through discussion, but also through reading articles that are provided by the facilitator or another teacher in the group, or perhaps by watching short clips of other teachers' classroom practice or relevant practical conference sessions. In the model, there's a lot of emphasis on thinking and reflecting before planning how to take action using what's been learned with the group. The teachers return to their classes to try out what they have learned. And during this period, in between the TAG meetings, they also have ongoing access to the other group members for support, usually via digital tools such as WhatsApp groups or other online forums. And then in the next session, when they come back, teachers are encouraged to report back on what worked, what didn't work, and to raise new issues to discuss. The groups, they might decide to focus on a particular aspect of teaching. For example, they might spend even a few months improving specifically on improving assessment techniques or a specific area like that, or they could be more general. And the intention is that over time, the need for a facilitator's input and their direction of what to focus on reduces, and the teachers themselves take more ownership of the focus and also of the activity that the group does, depending on what's required. So that's the model and how we designed the teacher activity groups to work. But I'm now going to hand over to Simon, who's going to talk us through the review that we did of TAGs and show us how they actually are in practice.
Thanks, Amy. So I'll tell you a bit about the process we went through in conducting this review of tag projects, and then I'll go on to talk about some of the key findings of the review. So as you can see in this slide, we looked at tag projects in 6 different countries. As Amy explained, these are all British Council professional development projects in which tags were a central part of the approach to professional development being used. So we looked at tags in 6 countries, and what we did, we collected as much evidence as we could get our hands on about these projects, particularly evaluation reports. So for each project, typically an evaluation is conducted, sometimes at midpoint, typically always at the end. So we requested access to these reports. We reviewed these reports. We looked at other types of documentation that were available in relation to these projects, such as materials used by teachers and facilitators and other forms of guidance. And we worked our way through all these documents, which was quite a large volume in the end. We had, for example, over 500 pages alone of evaluation reports from these projects. The projects varied in scale, as you can see there. Some were small, and by small we mean perhaps 150, 200 teachers on projects maybe that ran for 6 months or a year. In contrast, we had larger scale projects with over 20,000 teachers as well, which were using the tag model. Some projects were national, others were regional, others were statewide. So we had a good range of different parameters for these projects. I said what we did, we worked through all the reports and other documents that were available, and we focused on 2 things in particular. One was what evidence was available in these reports of the benefits to teachers of participating in tags, and secondly, what kinds of challenges were noted particularly in the evaluation reports. What sort of challenges had been faced by teachers themselves, by facilitators, by the people trying to the project teams who were responsible for the tags. And we wanted to look at challenges purposefully, of course, not to focus solely on the benefits, because part of this part of our purpose in doing the review was also to identify ways in which tags could be set up and run more effectively, and therefore by becoming aware of some of the challenges, we'd be able to make some recommendations to that effect. And as it says there, the final section of the report also includes a number of recommendations for organizing and running tags. So if we move on now, we can focus in more detail on some of the findings. One overall finding that we note in the report is that across the 6 projects that we looked at, overall, whether we were looking at the opinions of teachers or the opinions of facilitators or the opinions of local educational authorities, people were overwhelmingly positive about the concept. So this approach to professional development, which requires teachers to meet regularly, to interact regularly, to learn together with and with one another, as Amy explained, this was seen as a positive way of approaching professional development. It was liked by teachers, it was liked by facilitators, and local educational authorities also saw it as a positive development, as a positive alternative or addition, perhaps, to the forms of professional development that were already available in those contexts. So that's one overall finding. If we move on, we can look at some more specific findings in relation to this. One reason why teachers in particular said they liked tags is simply because they were different. And in many contexts, professional development for teachers follows a model through which perhaps they meet occasionally. As you can see in this quote, we have a teacher saying, before this tag project, we only met twice a year for official meetings. And this is perhaps still a fairly common experience for teachers around the world. So CPD involves formal meetings large meetings very often. And in those meetings, as we see in the quote, someone would give a presentation. That someone might be an official from the ministry who's providing updates on policy or informing teachers of changes in curriculum or examinations. And these are important things, of course. We're not saying that these kinds of meetings are not an important activity for teachers, but when CPD consists exclusively of these kinds of activities, perhaps teachers haven't got the opportunities they need to develop the kinds of competences they can apply in the classroom. And as we see in the quote there, and that was it. We never had the chance to discuss, to share ideas. So one overall reason that emerged from the review as to why teachers were positive about tags is simply they were a different approach to CPD. It was the novelty of it. It was a refreshing way for teachers to learn by meeting other teachers, by discussing with other teachers, by sharing with other teachers, doing that on a regular basis, and doing that perhaps in a more relaxing way than perhaps they'd encountered in other more formal types of professional development. So that's overall so far what we've said, that tags were generally welcomed by everyone involved, and particularly for teachers, it was the fact that they were so different to their previous experience of CPD, which appealed to them. Let's have a look at some other findings. So here on this slide, we've summarized a number of benefits which we extracted from across the reports, benefits for teachers participating in tags. Now, we're not saying that all of these benefits were present in equal measure across all the different projects, but looking across the projects, it was clear that tags have a wide range of benefits for teachers. So if we start from the top, then we found evidence of lots of teachers talking about benefits to their confidence. So whether it was through evaluation questionnaires they filled in, or focus group interviews they took part in, or individual interviews, teachers talked about the ways in which, as a result of taking part in tags, they felt more confident as teachers in the classroom. And here we have a quote from one teacher saying, "I discovered I was not the only one dealing with these issues, these problematic issues, these challenges. The support I got from the group helped me regain my self-confidence." And I think it's quite common for teachers around the world to live a somewhat isolated life professionally. And one consequence of that is when teachers encounter problems, they tend to feel guilty about it. And they tend to feel that they're the only one who's experiencing that challenge, and that's something they feel bad about. Participating in tags gave teachers opportunities to realize that other teachers share common challenges. And that was something that teachers found very refreshing, the recognition that they were not the only individuals struggling with particular classroom issues. And once there was that awareness within groups that there were shared challenges, shared concerns, shared issues to address in the classroom, the tag group provided mutual support for all its members. And in turn, that support helped teachers to become more confident. They no longer felt bad about having challenges, but saw those challenges as something that they could work through together with the group, and then return to the classroom with solutions to try out. The second one, we don't have a quote, we have a picture there, but the point is that teachers talked about the way in which participating in tags boosted their motivation as teachers. So they rediscovered some of the excitement of teaching, which perhaps had waned, particularly for those who were more experienced. They also discovered the motivation for professional development. Now, although professional development is intuitively something that we think teachers should look forward to, the reality is that teachers have had varying experiences of professional development in different contexts, and those experiences are not always positive. The consequence of that is, in some contexts, when teachers hear about professional development, their initial reaction is not a positive one. They might react by saying, well, this is going to be more of the same, of us sitting there and someone talking to us. However, as a result of participating in tags, teachers realize that professional development can take a different form, can be interactive, can be enjoyable, can be relevant, can be collegial and collaborative. And for all of those reasons, they found it a very motivating process. Of course, moving on to teaching skills, that's also something that teachers commented a lot upon in the reports we reviewed. Teachers gave many, many examples of the ways in which, as a result of tags, they had expanded the repertoire of strategies and activities they were familiar with. They were able to take those back into the classroom, to experiment with them, and to learn how to apply them effectively for the benefit of their own learners. And clearly that's a very important benefit for any kind of professional development activity. We want the professional development to feed back into what teachers do in the classroom. In other words, it's okay that teachers become more confident. It's okay that they become more motivated. But if they're not taking any of that confidence, motivation, any of those new ideas back into the classroom, then of course, the professional development is not fulfilling its overall purpose. Autonomy was another thing teachers talked about, the way in which participating in tags made them feel that they can address challenges perhaps they'd been stuck with for some time. So a lot of teachers talked about feeling helpless prior to tags, not feeling they could do anything to improve their situation, not feeling they could do anything to support their learners more effectively. Whereas as a result of tags, of the support they got through tags, of the ideas they got through tags, of the motivation they developed through tags, teachers were saying, yeah, now we feel we can make a difference. We can, even though we have to follow a prescribed syllabus, even within those constraints, there are things we can still do to innovate and to support our learners more effectively. That's also a very important impact we feel on teachers. Moving down to the bottom row, one of the goals of tags is typically to expose teachers to a wider range of resources, particularly resources that go beyond the textbook, and also included resources that can be found online. And again, teachers repeatedly noted in the reports that tags achieve that purpose. So they talked about not only being aware of new kinds of resources they could use, but also knowing how to access them, and of course, knowing how to take them into the classroom. And that allowed them to provide a bit more variety for their learners and to supplement the textbooks they regularly used. We've got 3 more here, and they're all supported by quotes from teachers on tagged projects. We've got awareness. This is an important part of professional development. We would hope that as a result of deep professional development, that teachers not only acquire new tips and strategies, but they also think more deeply about themselves as teachers and about their learners. So teachers talked about becoming more aware of themselves as teachers, more aware of what they do well and what they need to maybe do more effectively. In this quote, we've got a teacher talking about how they became more aware of their learners. So the teacher said, it became clear to me that my students were not robots. They were individuals whose needs, abilities, and feelings should be taken into consideration. That's quite an important shift in teacher awareness. So during tags, there were lots of opportunities for teachers to focus on learners, to think about learners, to talk about learners and learners' needs. And that kind of activity contributed to the developing awareness, as shown in this quote, of the students they worked with. We've got openness as another benefit for teachers. Openness can take various forms. There's openness to innovation. So we saw examples of teachers who said, before tags, we weren't really open to the idea of using innovative teaching strategies. We weren't really open to the idea of going beyond the materials. Whereas as a consequence of tags, those attitudes changed. Another type of openness that we can see in this quote here is the openness to admitting that we can all be better. the openness to admitting that sometimes we're wrong. And here we have a teacher saying, I learned not to be afraid of admitting that you might be wrong, admitting failure, not being ashamed of it. This is what we have all gone through in the tag. And it remains the case, as I said earlier, teachers very often work in isolation, and when they encounter problems, it's perhaps sometimes a source of guilt, or even more strongly, as this quote suggests, shame. And the collaborative and collegial nature of tags allows teachers over time to address these kinds of concerns. The trust is an important element of tags, because unless there is a trusting environment is established, teachers are not going to be willing to share these deeper concerns. But one strength of tags is that because they operate over time, they give teachers plenty of ongoing opportunities to develop strong relationships. And that takes us nicely onto the last point on this slide, which is indeed about relationships. And this was something that many teachers emphasized in their feedback on their experience. Relationships are key to tag. It is a community of practice, and therefore by definition, group dynamics are essential. And as I've already said, it is important, really important for tags to work well, to establish trusting, collegial, secure spaces in which teachers can share. In this quote, we see a teacher saying, before this project, we did not have an active network of support and advice between co-workers, which in this case means teachers. This is the first time when teachers managed to come together as a network and offer each other support. And this is something that teachers really appreciated. The fact that they realized there were other teachers out there they could bond with and who could be a source of support, of ongoing support for them. So a wide range of multiple teacher benefits here, resulting from the 6 tag projects we looked at. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And I'll hand back to Amy now, who will talk about some challenges and solutions highlighted in the report. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Simon. So there were several challenges which the project teams, the teachers, and also the tag facilitators faced when they were implementing the tag model. And these give rise to a number of recommendations should others be interested in setting up a tag themselves. So the first set of challenges, as you can see here, is related to organization, and in particular, shifting mindsets about the nature of professional development, as we've been discussing, and towards this more bottom-up and teacher-led approach. In many cases, the tag concept was really very different to what had been done in the past, and there was a tendency in some cases that we saw from the review we did for meetings to become more like workshops. So led by the facilitator making decisions about what would be covered, rather than staying true to the collaborative and reflective design that was intended. Ensuring that everyone involved understands the ethos of tags appeared to be quite critical to whether or not they were successful. Linked to this is issues around process, and it wasn't always evident that there were adequate opportunities for collaboration. And for many of the teachers, the idea of reflecting and the practice of reflecting on their own current or future practice was a skill that really needed quite significant development. While the facilitator, we didn't want the facilitator to take control per se of the whole tag activity, their support was really critical. And it was really clear that this group in particular needed to be very carefully trained to be clear about what their role was, but also what their role wasn't. So again, just going back to that point about not taking control in the same way that a trainer would lead a session. Equally, we found that projects where school leaders were sufficiently informed about the purpose and the focus of the tags were much more successful than where school leaders had not been informed of what they were trying to achieve. The content that was provided to the tag groups to work through was also very critical to their success. In some projects, it was felt that the content that was provided wasn't sufficiently linked either to the curriculum or to the context that the teachers were working within. And also trying to kind of wean the teachers off using the provided content and developing the skills they needed to find resources and content that helped them to find answers to their questions was also quite a challenge for many of the groups. Ensuring that adequate time was available was also quite difficult for some. Fitting in attending tags around the rest of the teachers' professional duties and their personal commitments could be challenging, particularly given that it was on this monthly basis and not just kind of once or twice a year. And also making sure that there were adequate incentives in place, that teachers knew the purpose, the reason, the benefits that they would gain from attending and felt that they were actually getting those benefits. And then finally, administrative issues were a challenge in some places. So getting information to and from the teachers who were meant to be participating, ensuring that the venues were regularly available. And we also identified a need for more consistent evaluation across the projects so that in future we would be better able to draw conclusions about what wasn't and what is and isn't effective. And we could look across the board with very common types of data that have been collected. So I'm now going to hand over to Radhika, who's going to summarize our session, and then we'll get on to answering your questions that you've been sending in.
Thanks, Amy. All right, then. In conclusion, then, I'm just going to outline some of the key conclusions of the review. Tags do support CPD. So overall, tags, it came out that tags did support CPD. They were very positively viewed by a range of stakeholders, including teachers, and in some cases, even government authorities. Totally speaking, they turned out to be powerful sources of collaboration to engage in CPD. There were also multiple areas of teacher growth, as Simon pointed out, including teacher confidence, motivation, most importantly, willingness to innovate, and knowledge and use of learner-centered strategies in their classrooms. There were, of course, stronger teacher relationships. Again, a sort of a highlight of these tags was that teachers were able to build and engage in a safe space that was created through a lot of trust, sharing and reflection that was done together as part of the tags. Most importantly, again, improving student motivation, right? Many teachers also reported that participating in tags had a wider impact on how their students experienced lessons. So essentially, and this enhanced their student experiences for the teachers. And of course, as a result, student motivation was enhanced as well. Having said this, I think tags can come across as a very simple concept, really, a group of people meeting and sharing ideas or reflecting together, even doing things together. However, in practice, there are certain things that need to be kept in mind. They can be quite complex. Most importantly, as Amy just pointed out, the concept of tag, how each of the stakeholder understands the concept is very important. There needs to be a consistent understanding of what is supposed to be done in a tag meeting or what the roles are of different participants to avoid, as Amy rightly pointed out, to avoid a tag meeting quickly turn into a workshop. The other bit was, of course, so who organizes this tag? Where is it organized, and how to manage teacher attendance, for example, where key issues can be a barrier that can limit effectiveness of tags. And lastly, facilitator competencies, right? Tags, of course, can exist without facilitators if you choose so. But if facilitators are an important aspect of tags, then their own training and development, their own motivation needs to be also factored in while planning for these tags. And as Simon pointed out right at the beginning, that reflection and inquiry is at the center of tag meetings. So if that doesn't happen enough, if there's no substantial and deep reflection on what's being shared, then it's very unlikely that it will impact classrooms positively. With that, there could be, the last point is pretty much about what can be done about these barriers, because if you deal with these barriers, then tags are a beautiful concept and really useful for teachers. So the first thing to do is, of course, to build in adequate systemic support. Who is organizing the tags, and where are these tags organized? If roles are clearly marked, then that kind of systemic support that helps embed the tag into the system very effectively will help tags in the longer run. Facilitator training. enough adequate training opportunities for facilitators to clarify their roles and build on their facilitation skills is key. And lastly, things to do to improve teacher reflection and inquiry is, again, embedding that kind of awareness sessions or training for facilitators and teachers is, again, key, so that tags become successful for teachers. So with that, moving on to the next slide, I think this quotation from one of the teachers who was part of the project that we reviewed says it all. And it's a beautiful conclusion to how tags can be effective for teachers. So this teacher says that tags were very important to them, a community of teachers where I could express my doubts, my questions, and my failures. The most important thing that stands out for me is where I've learned what it means to be a teacher, the ways of becoming an inspiration for your students and working on their behalf. And tags were the most significant teacher development group I've ever attended. I think that really sums it up in favor of tags, really. And with that, we end this presentation, but we do request you to look at the report in detail. Paul, it's on the next slide, the link. Yes, we do request you to look at the report in more detail to read about all these aspects. Thank you very much. I think we are open for question and answer then.
We are indeed. Thank you, Radhika. And thank you, Amy, and thank you, Simon. Thanks very much for that, yeah, very engaging, very interesting presentation about the teacher activity groups. I'm going to come on to some questions. A lot of them, I'm sort of trying to group them together. The same theme. There were a lot of questions about. There were two kind of main themes, I suppose. One of the themes. You could put your cameras on. That would be great as well. Each of you. Fantastic. And Radhika, if you could put your camera on as well, that'd be lovely. Thank you. A lot of people were asking about how they become part of teacher activity group. I mean, obviously, with the work you were doing, I imagine there was a sort of a system in place. But if someone was looking to become part of a teacher activity group, is there any advice you can give or some processes that you can sort of suggest for them, Amy?
Yeah, I saw that question coming up quite a lot in the chat and also in the Q&A. So, and it's a good question. I think the point with tags is that they were largely set up with the governments in each of the locations. And actually, just very quickly to tell you, people were asking which 6 countries we reviewed. So I'll just quickly run through where those countries are actually. So we looked at projects that had taken place in Armenia, Jordan, Romania, I'm going to have to not forget them all, India, Egypt, and the occupied Palestinian territories. So in all of those countries, plus several other ones actually that we didn't get a chance to include in our review, there are tags operating, mostly in collaboration with government. So if you're in one of those countries, then it would definitely be worth looking in to see whether there's a tag locally that you could join. If there aren't tags running in your country, there is absolutely nothing stopping you from setting up your own tag. You know, it is a community of practice. It's just that we provided a bit more structure than perhaps some other more informal communities of practice have. So by all means, you could go ahead and, you know, using what you've learned from what we said today and also take a look at the report for more detail about how they're run, you could set your own up. And work with a small group of teachers that you're familiar with. There's no limit on the size in terms of the minimum size. It could just be 3 people working together. And by all means, call it a tag. That's fine.
Just kind of on that last point, you said there's no sort of minimum number. Is there a sort of an optimum number? I mean, someone was talking, I think, earlier on about a WhatsApp group where there are kind of 3,000 teachers involved. Is that, I mean, that to me sounds quite a challenge. for various reasons. I mean, with the groups that you were working with, or with the tags that you looked at, did there seem to be an optimum number that worked best? I don't know who wants to answer that one.
Radhika, do you want to say a bit about the tag size in India, how it's worked?
Yes. So good question, actually, Paul. In India, we had a maximum number of 25, although, of course, there were more participants sometimes in some of the clubs. But we did notice that the number could ideally be in that range. Otherwise, there could be challenges around ownership of the of learning processes. If there are too many and it's too crowded, then it seemed like it could get a little challenging in terms of running the tag processes in a particular meeting, or keeping track of who's attending. So for all logistical purposes, as well as purely from a perspective of effective CPD, I think maybe good number could be 25 to 30, but I think there are projects where there is a bigger number, and different aspects could be put in, different control mechanisms or different structures could be put in place to make those clubs effective. Just slightly different for online groups, right? That could be, I mean, essentially bigger groups as well for online tags, if you call them. In India, we did have maximum 25.
Okay, thanks, Radhika. Just another theme that seems to have come up. So I sort of group it together. I think you talked about it a little bit at the start with the idea of Cascade sort of training, where perhaps it's not necessarily relevant to all teachers, or it doesn't sort of resonate. It's I suppose it's not self-directed in some ways. But as a kind of a hangover perhaps from that, with that sort of Cascade model, and from the sort of model of working within an institution where there is some kind of formal recognition perhaps of the professional development that you do, either through a certificate or it's through, I don't know, increased pay, etc., etc. I don't want to talk about, I don't want to call it rewards, but I suppose that's one way of putting it, that sort of extrinsic motivation with teacher activity groups, where they are perhaps quite dispersed, where there are large numbers of teachers working in different institutions. What was the kind of the response to that, and how is that kind of managed, the sort of the formal recognition perhaps of being part of a tag?
Shall I start, and then Simon, maybe if you want to add anything. So in some countries, because there's a collaboration with the government, tag meetings are recognized towards any number of days that teachers are required to undertake professional development activity. So if that's the case, then it counts towards those, and then therefore, that's partly the sort of extrinsic incentive, if you like. That's one element of it. But I know in at least one of the countries that we looked at, I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it was, it wasn't linked to government. But there were perhaps other incentives in place. Simon, is there anything else that you can say about that?
Yeah, so I think the point here is to do with the extent to which the tags are plugged in a sense to the local educational system, and we saw variations across that. So for example, in one context, teachers were given half a day off work to attend tags. In most of the others, they weren't. They were expected to do tags in their own time. In one of the projects, as Amy mentioned, it wasn't officially supported by the Ministry of Education, and so the awareness of the project within schools wasn't that high, and the involvement of the ministry wasn't particularly high either. And that's had some benefits as well for the teachers, because they said they felt under less pressure than they do when they're working within a formal structure. But we found variations in the extent to which the systems were the tags were plugged in to local educational systems. And when we start talking about incentives and other kinds of support, of course, the more effectively the tags are plugged in, the more likely that's going to be. So if schools are aware of tags, if the tags are being supported by the system, schools are aware of them, schools recognize the benefits of them, teachers are more likely to get some kind of support. at the under end of the scale, if that's not the case, that won't happen. Ideally, of course, teachers' efforts and achievements are acknowledged in some way, but it did vary from context to context.
Can I just add one thing? I think it's also really important to sort of highlight that the tag model, the underlying aim of it was really to try and give power back to the teachers, so that it's the teachers themselves who are deciding what it is they want to focus on for their professional development and how they can best do that, and working collaboratively together to find those solutions, rather than someone coming along and sort of telling them, you need to study this and get better at that, and this is how you're going to do it. So ultimately, that was a sort of fundamental thing. And I think for many teachers, that was an incentive enough, you know, to suddenly feel that they had that autonomy and that agency to be able to make those decisions for perhaps the first time. So in some cases.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess in some ways, that the kind of the formal situation where you turn up and you go to a training session, and it might be relevant or it might not be, but essentially, I mean, okay, before COVID, essentially people were traveling physically to a space, to sit in a room, to be given activities potentially on a theme or a topic. Whereas with this, it seems to be, as you say, sort of far more self-directed. So, but what I wanted to ask actually was right at the beginning, you were talking about setting the tags up, and that it's set up by someone and it focuses on a specific thing. What's the kind of the flexibility within the tag for teachers who come along to that? I'll come on, there's another question about that in a minute, but to then kind of bend or alter the direction of the focus of the tag if they want to. Do they have to kind of go off and form a sub tag, or does the tag evolve with the kind of the will, if you like, of the teachers involved?
Shall I answer this one? Yeah. So I mean, I think we see it as an evolving system in a sense. So at the beginning of the process, tags are a new way of learning for many teachers, and indeed for the facilitators who are supporting them. So I think what the experience has been is that initially it's good to provide some structure, both in terms of guidance as to the different stages of a meeting, as well as to content. So I think, bringing people together, putting them in a room without any content and saying, get on with it, in many contexts wouldn't work, simply because it's a new way of thinking and learning. So we found that structure at the beginning is good, and it provides a framework in which people can develop skills and confidence, in order to learn in those new ways. As time passes, and as we said, some of these projects have lasted a year, some have lasted 3 years, as time passes, the hope is that as teachers' confidence increases, as the facilitators' confidence increase, a lot of the content then starts to emerge more organically from within the group. So teachers would come back from the classroom very often, would create the content themselves, would say, look, I'm bringing something back from my classroom, a piece of work a student did, a video of me teaching something, and that becomes the content of the session. Or teachers would say, well, at the moment we really need some help. This is a typical one for this year. We need some help in teaching online, and that might not have been one of the topics in the original content. That's great. So then collaboratively, they develop that. Maybe in some cases a teacher or two teachers have taken responsibility for preparing a session and actually leading it. So even the leadership of the sessions then over time can move from the one facilitator to a number of co-facilitators from the group. So, ideally we see it as this kind of evolution from structured and more controlled at the beginning to more sort of emergent, organic, and teacher-led as things evolve. And how far that's happened, of course, varies across the projects for different reasons.
Just wanted to add to what Simon said, Paul, quickly. I think even within the structure, initially there was flexibility offered to teachers to use the structures they liked. For example, if they chose to focus on a particular aspect of the tag more, it was okay. It was communicated. It's okay to do that. But I think one of the observations was also that, once you give that structure, it's very difficult. It was difficult for teachers to not follow it, really. And that was, again, an observation we made, and a learning for us that, it's very important to sort of have, as Amy put it sometime back in one of our discussions, like a disappearing structure, and really support key stakeholders in taking over tags completely. But even within that structure, it was flexibility was very rarely practiced by tag members.
Okay. One question that's sort of vaguely sort of come about in the Q&A and also through the chat, also something that I was thinking about, and from my own experience perhaps, is presumably the teachers who took part in the tags. I'm just wondering if there was a kind of a profile of that kind of teacher. Are they the teachers who are fairly self-motivated anyway, and would sort of take part in professional development activity, or did the way that it was set up, and did that appeal perhaps to more reluctant teachers who are less kind of willing to engage in professional development? Or did you notice any kind of change in the profile? Did the ones who initially joined because they were motivated anyway somehow kind of, did that encourage the ones who were less motivated because they saw the way that it was set up and running?
Shall I say something about this? So I think, as Amy mentioned, a lot of the projects were centrally organized, and teachers were therefore nominated by their local education authority to participate. And we recognize the difficulties with that model, because you may have people who are being sort of compelled to take part. So from that point of view, I don't think there was a particular profile, in a sense of, because in 5 out of the 6 cases they were nominated. But what we did see, though, is that even where initially teachers maybe were slightly resistant because they had been told to join the program, once they realized that it was a different kind of program, once they recognized that it was of value to them, that it was giving them ideas and materials and activities they could use with their learners, and once they realized that those materials and activities were actually helpful in their classroom, of course their motivation started to change. So we do have, again, as part of the evolution of tags, maybe initial resistance, maybe based on prior experiences, prior negative experiences of CPD within certain systems, then moving towards more positive attitudes towards CPD as a realization of the issues I've mentioned. And that, to me, suggests that it's not always a huge problem to compel people to take part in professional development, as long as it's been designed effectively and is going to be of some value to teachers. Once they recognize that, attitudes do change.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I mean, my sort of experience of working in this is that often, you will find that something which some people will always resist something which is organized formally, that they've been compelled to do, but ultimately the benefit of it rests within the activity itself once they've kind of taken part and once they're involved in it and they see the benefits. So yeah, no, good to see. Thank you. I'm just aware of the time and the fact that we need to stop. We've gone over a little bit, so I could talk about this for quite a lot longer, to be honest. But just to say, finally, thank you to Simon, to Amy, to Radhika for as I say, a great presentation looking at tags, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. I hope it's been useful to you. If you do want to have a look a little bit more and download the publication, I've just put the link into the page on the Teaching English website, where you can, where there's a link to the publication. There's also the certificate, and the slides are available there as well. So if you go to the page, if you can scroll back up through the chat quickly enough and get that link, and then you can find it. If not, please do complete the feedback survey, where there's also links there. It should open automatically when this webinar ends, but I'll just put another link in there. That's the link to the survey. Please do share your feedback. It's always useful to get your thoughts on things, as it helps us prepare and plan for future webinars. And talking of which, we have another webinar next week, possibly the last webinar before the end of the year, possibly not. There's another one planned. On the 9th, next Wednesday, will be a webinar looking at teacher wellbeing, and that's an ultra research project presentation. You can find more information about that on Teaching English. Simon, Radhika, Amy, thank you ever so much for taking time out to join us, and thank you for the presentation, and also for the publication as well, which is great. We're looking at that earlier on.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
So
Thanks, Paul.
thanks, and hopefully see you again soon. Thanks everyone for joining us, and yeah, we'll hopefully see you next week. Okay, bye everyone.